So Confucianism, the way of virtue and the moral social order. In the spirit and tradition of China, and this goes for both Confucians and Taoists for over 2 millennia, the first thing Chinese children are taught at home and in school is not see Dick run or run Jane run or things like that. It's actually human beings are by nature good. Think about that. Not only think about what it says, which is profound, but that society-wide, in every family, every school, this attitude, this public moral value is instilled in children from the very beginning of their lives in an intentional, consistent, public manner. Human beings are by nature good. And again, that's both for Confucians and Taoists. So Confucius, also known as Master Kong, died almost 2,500 years ago, thinking that his life had been a total failure. He taught young men, preparing them for careers, and then as a court advisor, thinking that if he was able to get a ruler or some other high-ranking official in the government to adopt his philosophy for an entire state, he could make an even bigger difference. But none ever did, and he remained a politician laboring in anonymity, kind of a mid-level bureaucrat, laboring in anonymity for most of his career. It was only 300 years after his death, during the Han Dynasty, which is between 202 BCE and the 2nd century in our era, China's golden age, that Confucianism became the official state ideology, and Confucian schools were established to teach Confucian ethics. Like all leaders, like all of us, the context in which Confucius lived shaped his thought. He lived at a time during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE when the great Zhou dynasty was beginning to collapse, resulting in social anarchy and political chaos. Chivalry had died, boundaries collapsed between states, and warring tribes raided each other's lands. There were instances of horrible torture. Conquered peoples were thrown into boiling cauldrons. There was cannibalism. Whole populations, men, women, the aged, children, were slaughtered. There are accounts of 40,000, 60,000, even 400,000 in mass executions. Life became cheap. A herd mentality ruled. And in the midst of the chaos, Confucius recalls the good old days, a societal order based in the traditions of a previous age. His insight in the midst of the social, moral, and political anarchy was a question. What are the traditions, the principles, the mores, the values that hold a people together in a family, a community, in a country? And by the way, isn't that the same question we're asking in our country today? What will bind us together? So he focused on the importance of relationships to personal identity, especially the family as foundation of society, the cultivation of virtue to make mature persons, and that personal morality matters in the public sphere. Remember 2 weeks ago, the yin and the yang? Confucianism is the yang to Taoism's yin, which means male energy, focusing on action, order, form, reason, and more. We'll talk about Taoism next week. And again, this doesn't talk just about this. This isn't men and women. I mean, there are male energies and women and female energies and men, but this was the paradigm, the framework in which they understood things. He forged a middle path between two opposing philosophies. One group was called the legalists, who believed that human beings, although by nature good, tended, because of culture, because of other forces, they tended toward evil. So obedience is the ultimate virtue. I think of legalists as the Augustinians. Their answer to the question, what do you do to get people to become moral, is threaten them, and if they don't comply, punish them. They advocated a legal system and a religion, too, that instilled obedience under the force of penalties and rewards. Well, Confucius rejected this approach because law and religion, he said, should inspire people to a higher virtue than mere obedience out of fear. And that freedom, virtue, in our day, democracy, should grow up from below, from within the good intentions of the people, not forced from the outside. So on the one side, there were legalists. Confucius rejects them. The other side are called the Mohists, after Mozi, their founder. They believed the solution to China's social problem was not force, but appealing to the original good nature within each person, to universal love. And even though Confucius believed human beings were by nature good, he also knew what human reality had been looking like in his day, that human nature, although good, still had the possibility within it of being corrupted. So he said of himself that, quote, the way of the superior person I have not been able to do. Sounds like St. Paul, right? The good that I would do, I do not do. And the bad stuff that I don't want to do, I end up doing anyway. So Confucius rejected this social philosophy of universal love as too naive and simplistic and utopian. He taught a middle path. To go too far, he said, is just as bad as to not go far enough. So he introduced the concept of li, propriety, appropriateness, decorum, to cultivate virtue. Li can also mean ritual or education. So this is what it looked like in real life. With his young students, he would present them with literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scenarios, as spouses, as parents and children, as students in society, as friends, as citizens, and to discuss with them appropriate behaviors. How do you treat your elderly parents? What happens when a friend gets sick? How do you treat a child when you see them on the street without a parent? I mean, I'm kind of making these up, but every possible scenario, Confucius would present his students and ask, what is the appropriate action in such a situation? And they would go through over and over and over again different scenarios. So these are some of the things that he says in his Analects, his discussed sayings. You got to be concerned about the moral character, not only within you, but of your environment. What do you surround yourself with? Who do you surround yourself with? What does your environment look like? You put your duties to others first. That's virtue. To investigate truth wherever it leads, that's virtue. But the most important virtue, he says, in his Analects, which are discussed sayings, he describes as Chen or Ren, what he calls the virtue of virtues. You've heard this before, right? What I do not wish others to do to me, that also I wish not to do to them. That is the goal of the superior person. Finding the balance between respecting yourself and treating others in a human and humane way, retaining dignity, both for you and for the other. And of course, you recognize this as the Confucian version of the Golden Rule. By the way, the Golden Rule in China and its Indian counterpart and its Jewish counterpart all kind of came about within 200 or 300 years of each other in different places around the world. That's another interesting scholarly study. How did that happen? The middle path, Confucius says, that's where we find it. Love of kindness is a good thing, but without virtue, it's obscured by petty pandering. Love of knowledge is a good thing, but without virtue, it loses its way through loose speculation. Love of the truth is a good thing, but without virtue, it's halted by candor, although honest, intended to hurt. Love of adventure is a good thing, but without virtue, it's disloyalty. Love for strength of character is a good thing, but without virtue, it finds itself lost in stubbornness. Again, this is from the Analects. He also taught what he calls junsu, the ideal, the mature person. He calls it a gentleman. Sometimes it's translated gentleman, but really what it means, humanity at its best. Humanity at its best. There are 4 things, he says, in the way of the superior person: to serve my parents as I would expect my children to serve me, to serve my leaders as I would expect those under me to serve me, to serve my elders as I would expect those younger than me to serve me, to be the first to treat friends as I would expect them to treat me. And these I've not been able to do, he says. In other words, this is kind of an extension, right, of the Golden Rule. You notice, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, Yang is all about behavior. That behavior changes the heart. It's not that the heart changes first and then it changes the behavior. He focuses on behavior, and behavior can change the heart. This is the one half of the yin and yang. So how would you order a society's institutions to reflect these virtues? How would you structure your family life, your work environment, a judicial system, an educational system, a healthcare system? How would you structure a religious organization to reflect such virtues? What structures would you need to support parents in their parenting, children in their growth, business and labor, patients, citizens, leaders, and others? What values are important to our collective well-being? This is the Confucian agenda. And so what he says is, what matters is the rebuilding of the social fabric, a sense of community. And he identified 5 constant relationships. 5 constant relationships as the places where these values would be nurtured: parent-child, spouse-spouse, sibling-sibling, ruler-citizen, and friend and friend. Confucius says that you are never an isolated individual by yourself. Your identity is an amalgamation of all your relationships. That every decision, every action impacts another. So a millennium before John Donne, Confucius was teaching that no one was an island. You're a network of relationships that has shaped you, made you the person who you are, and you, by your choices and behavior in turn, affect a whole network of people with whom you're related as well. He said that apart from human relationships, there is no self. There is no isolated self apart from human relationships. And he noticed that 3 of these 5 relationships had to do with family. Sometimes Confucianism is called familyism. Think seriously about this. What does it really mean to say that the family is the basic unit of society? And think about what it means. Well, how do you define what family is? Now, we define family more broadly in our day than 5th century BCE China, right? I mean, we'd like to think that we've grown some in 2,500 years. But whatever the shape of your family, I mean, you know, when you hear some people on the religious right talking about family values, you know, it's pretty narrow. At Plymouth Church, when we talk about family values, it's much more broad and open and diverse. But whatever the shape of your family, what values and virtues are being taught there? What did you learn about being a son, a daughter, a sibling, a husband, a wife from your family? And what are you teaching others in your immediate and then broader family life? Even the family of a community. Or, as Confucius might put it, the family of a nation. Now, he recognizes that, well, let me talk about Xiao now for a second. Xiao, which is literally translated as filial piety, is the honor and respect that children owe their parents, and parents as children owe their own parents, and on, that all of us, for our ancestors, have gone before us. So it starts with the family. But even more, he says, it applies to each one of the 5 constant relationships. So spouse for spouse, friend for friend, a mutual relationship between citizens and rulers, etc. And not only respect, but also the duty and the responsibility that we have for each other. Now, Confucius realizes that this isn't a blind honor, as if mistakes, and often terrible mistakes and cruelties, don't happen in families, even in the best of families. But there's a general principle that with age comes wisdom that you just can't learn anywhere else. Ancestors and the elderly are held in high esteem, by the way, as well as little children, because of their openness to learning and because they remind the rest of us of our original goodness. So both ends of the spectrum, of the age spectrum, are held in high regard in Confucianism. So again, Confucianism believes that this primary family relationship, for good and for ill, helps to form societal values, and so is essential that society pays attention to it and provides institutions and structures to help families do their work. The family is the basic unit of society, but the virtues learned in the family move beyond the family to the community, then to the nation, then to the entire world, and to even nature itself. Confucius says that in shifting the center of your concern From yourself to your family, you transcend selfishness. The move from family to community transcends nepotism. The move from community to nation overcomes parochialism, and the move to all humanity counters a chauvinistic nationalism. And this brings us to probably the most important concept in Chinese political thought, Tianming, the so-called mandate of heaven, which was introduced into Chinese culture 500 years before Confucius, but which was codified during his lifetime and in subsequent years. Let me tell you a little bit about the mandate of heaven. In the middle of the 11th century BCE, so this is 500 years before Confucianism, the Zhou conquered the Shang and began a 790-year rule, the longest ruling dynasty in Chinese history. But like most regimes, they sought to legitimize their claim to rule. So they invented a new doctrine, which they named Tianming, Tian, heaven. By the way, Tiananmen Square, Tiananmen means the gate of heaven. This central place in China where the protests occur. Tian, heaven, Ming, destiny. Tianming, the mandate of heaven. The idea is this, that the mandate to reign is given to a ruler who's now called the Son of Heaven on condition that they rule justly, putting the welfare of the people before his own. But this means that the mandate can be withdrawn at any time if he's unfair, unethical in his dealings with people, or even if bad things happen during his reign. By the way, if you think about it, even in our day, the mandate of heaven was often invoked by revolutionaries to overthrow the sitting government in China. This idea took hold very quickly throughout China, and by the time of Confucius, 500 years later, it applied to not only political leaders, but others too, in business and religion, even in family life. It became the moral basis for Chinese social life. So it was in the 4th century BCE that Confucian scholar Mencius put it like this: the people are of supreme importance. The altars of gods and of earth and grain come next. Last comes the ruler. That is why he who gains the confidence of the multitudinous people will be emperor. When a feudal lord endangers the altars of the gods of the earth and grain, he should be replaced. Now, 2 final notes about the mandate of heaven. First, on the one hand, we can understand this cynically, right? As here is a dynasty that was legitimizing its own hold on power. So that we get that. Every regime, every administration in our world, every ruling authority attempts to legitimize its rule. I mean, I'm thinking of parts of the Old Testament where David hired court historians, which we find in the Old Testament that traces his claim back to first chapters of Genesis. That's why rulers have court historians to kind of establish their claim to rule. But if you think about it more positively, it was a reform movement that was trying to do away with bloodline dynasties like monarchies. So just because you're the son of the previous emperor, that doesn't give you the claim to rule. Even so, bloodline dynasties. So the mandate of heaven tried to base ruling on virtue. And by the way, we find this in the West centuries later in the so-called divine right of kings in Europe. And we even see this taking place when the US presidents invoke just war theory to justify military actions. Every ruling authority tries to justify its claim and its actions on something transcendent to themselves. Alrighty, I'm wrapping up here now, gang. So again, the main question for Confucius, I mean, think about this. In every religious tradition or ideology, they try to answer a particular question. For Lutherans, by the way, and for many Christians, the question was, how can I be saved? And so many religious traditions, many Christian traditions have established whole theologies, right? Whole faith systems to try to answer that question. Others, what is the answer to death? And by the way, a question for you might be, well, what is the question that your life is trying to answer? What is the question your life is trying to answer? Or your belief system, worldview, value system? What's the central question that's driving you? For Confucius, it's how does one order a society? How do you cultivate virtue? How shall we raise our children, and all children, because all children are our children? How do we raise them to be virtuous, moral, upright, productive citizens? To cultivate virtue through propriety and living out the golden rule in individual and family life. That's what Confucius's agenda was. I'll say that again. To cultivate virtue through propriety and living out the golden rule in individual and family life. That's the gift of Confucius for us today. He realized a fundamental principle of human life, that together with others, you can be a better person than you can be by yourself. If there's righteousness in the heart, he says, there will be beauty in the character. If there's beauty in the character, there will be harmony in the home. If there's harmony in the home, there will be order in the nation. And if there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. Okay, gang. You can see this is very young, can't you? Very much, very young. So there you have it. Linda, I'm ready for questions or comments.
Okay, questions in the room. There are, please come up and say them into the computer so people can see it.
Where would you like to jump in, gang? What do you think?
I have a question, Michael.
Come on.
Please, gang. Yeah, Gary.
In our today's society, where do tribes? We're all in different tribes now. How would you fit the word tribe into all of this?
Well, thanks so much for that, Gary. Well, there were different factions in Chinese society and different tribes in Chinese society. Confucius says that you have to start, you can't tackle the big and then move to the little. You start closest to yourself, you start closest to home, and you start practicing these virtues within the family. I mean, I'm going to, within those people closest to you. Spouse, children, and then of course in Confucius time, it wasn't just your immediate family, but grandparents, nieces, aunts, uncles. I mean, it was tribal in that regard. But then as you practice these virtues in the smallest unit, that would grow and grow and grow and grow beyond the immediate family to the larger family, to the small community in which you live, the tribe perhaps, and then beyond tribes borders to other tribes and other clans. So I mean, in some ways he was utopian, but it was very practical because, like I say, the virtue of virtues was the golden rule, and it was about behavior. Even if you felt a certain animosity to someone else, you treated the other person like you wanted to be treated. Now, you know, and he believed, by the way, he believed that as you treated a person that you had animosity for, an enemy even, if you treated them with as you would want them to treat you, with a certain responsibility to that person in a community, that would not only change that other person, but it would change your own heart. So that was kind of his particular faith statement. Behavior changes the heart. We normally think that, you know, you got to feel a certain way and then that will change your behavior. You know, it's very Adlerian, you know, if you think about it. Behavior changes the heart. It doesn't have to go. It can work vice versa, but it doesn't have to. You start with the small, Gary, and move out to the larger units in the society and beyond. Anybody else? Thanks, Gary. Hi, Christine. You're muted.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of women in Confucianism. I think one of the modern criticisms of it that I've read is that women do not have great power of any kind or many rights within Confucianism. And I was wondering if you could talk about rights versus roles and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, in Confucius Day, of course, and by the way, thanks again, Terry. In Confucius Day, it for sure, I mean, very patriarchal, right? And like most ancient wisdom traditions, Confucianism in our day is undergoing a radical rethinking. So, for example, I'll give you the example in Christianity, and then we'll apply it to Confucianism, Chris. In our day, there are different Christian understandings of the role of women. So on the one hand, you've got a Plymouth Church. On the other hand, you've got James Dobson in Colorado Springs and Focus on the Family, who interprets Christianity like they did maybe at the time of the first century, you know, or you know, our medieval view. Well, you're right that one of the real tension points within modern day Confucianism is that now there are more, there are reform movements within today's Confucianism by Confucian feminists trying to reinterpret the tradition, or trying to draw from Confucius's own writings tenets that would set women free. So trying to maybe do the historical critical method on Confucius's Analects, or other of Confucius, other of the writings from the early tradition, to try to show even you know, for example, even our Declaration of Independence, you know, where it didn't recognize women or people of color, but the Supreme Court has seen the seeds of freedom in the Declaration of Independence. Well, modern feminists and their supporters within Confucianism are trying to see the seeds of women's liberation and women's power and women's dignity in the original writings of Confucianism. So you're right, it's one of the real pressure points within modern day Confucianism to see if that can take place. And there are many Confucian feminist scholars doing that today. But if you look at the traditional writings, they're very patriarchal. There's no question about that. You put your finger on a real pressure point. Absolutely. It's like all these wisdom traditions, and all these, great ideologies, but that's why you can't, it's happening in Islam, right? I mean, we've got Muslims trying to interpret Sharia law from the 9th century in a very literal fashion. And then you've got other Muslim scholars that are trying to say that Muslim law needs to evolve. That's why, for example, in the United Church of Christ, one of our symbols, right, is a comma. God is still speaking. So, I mean, that's important in religious traditions and in worldviews and value systems, that they continue to evolve as we learn more things about who we are as people, and as we learn more about human consciousness and what it means to be free. You raised an important issue, Chris, not only for Confucianism, but for every wisdom tradition in the world. That's why I like the UCC's use of a comma, and as a symbol. Thank you. And by the way, that should work not only for our religions, but in each one of our lives. How can you incorporate into your own worldview and your own value system a comma? Are you still open to growth, to changing your views, to enlarging your worldview? I really appreciate that, Chris. Who else?
Well, I guess I have a question. So, I mean, I guess the problem that you're alluding to is that if this focus in Confucianism is on propriety, that's some kind of conformity with a sense of the good, right? That everybody has a shared understanding of what the good is. But the problem is that over time, that sense of the good changes. And I think that one of the dilemmas of this is that if this works, if everybody has the same understanding of what the good is that they're actually conforming to. But in what way does the system adapt as the culture changes how they understand what the good is? Because the good isn't a static idea, it's something that changes and develops. It's the comma, is what you're talking about. So a virtue itself is some kind of conformity with the standard, but the standard itself is changing constantly. How does the culture adapt to that changing sense of what the good is? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and that's been one of the criticisms. And by the way, this works with every wisdom tradition, not just with Confucianism. Not only making a particular historical or cultural perspective, you use the word static, but laying it in concrete for all time. But also, who decides?
Right.
Who decides what is the good, right? So again, this can be one of the criticisms of Confucianism. So I'll say two more things, because you really placed your finger again on another one of these tensions in Confucianism. The question about li, what is appropriate, needs to keep being asked in every generation, because what was appropriate in 500 BCE as it wasn't appropriate in 100 in our era, or in the medieval period, or in our day, right? I mean, what's appropriate changes. But what doesn't change, and this is where Confucianism, this is the heart of Confucianism, and that is the golden rule doesn't ever change. So in every age, you if a person asks themselves the question, how do I want to be treated? That's how I should treat the other. That's why it's called the virtue of virtues in Confucianism. But you're right. I mean, we're talking, I had 20 minutes to talk about Confucianism. We're talking kind of idealistically here, but how this plays itself out in everyday Chinese families and in societies, when there's a propensity for the rulers to stay in power, when there's a propensity, even though human beings are by nature good, toward looking after our own self-survival first and our own self-interest first, So you're exactly right. This is one of those places, these dangers that Confucianism has to address. And that is, what is the good, and does it change, and who decides what is the good? You made an important insight.
Mr. Terry, I have a comment, Michael, on this.
And by the way, as a scholar,
This
yeah, Terry.
conversation. Yeah.
Yep.
The question about religion adapting to the cultural condition and the definition of what is good that was raised. I find it interesting that religion adapts according to changing cultures. And an example I experienced in Christianity was in traveling to India. I visited Calcutta and the tomb of St. Thomas the Apostle. And the belief is that Thomas the Apostle traveled to India. And the Church of St. Thomas is of the Thomas tradition, which is Gnostic in origin. And the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas asks the question, or says the good is, I recognize the God in you. The kingdom within, or the kingdom among us, is the translation of Jesus' kingdom message that the Thomas Christians adapted in India, and it persists to this day, and is very consistent with the Hindu idea of namaste. I recognize the good in you, the God in you, and the Thomas Christians, that's one of the higher order good. And it resonated with Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism to recognize that other. And I'm not as familiar with Confucianism, but the ancestral concept of Chinese recognition of the good is another important aspect, I thought. So I don't know if there's a carryover between Buddhism and Confucianism, where Buddhism got adopted in China as well.
Thanks, Terry. If you think about it, namaste, recognizing the good and the divine in each other, recognizing that takes the golden rule and just ups the ante, right? It makes the golden rule, it takes the golden rule, which focuses on behavior, and makes it about the character of the other. Yeah, and Terry, you're exactly right. I guess what I want to, there are a number of things to take away for today. I'm aware of the time, gang. And again, thanks for your patience with the link this morning. It's important to ask the question about how we order a society. What are the structures that need to be in place? We're asking this just in politics in our day about a Confucian would say that asking about early child care, help for families that focus on prenatal and natal and early childhood health care in a society. Any kind of help that we can give to families, that's a religious concern. It's not just public policy, you know? So ordering a society, beginning with the family and moving like Gary was suggesting to larger and larger units in a society. Those are the concerns of a Confucian. But even for ourselves now, you know, we're not going to adopt maybe Confucianism for ourselves, but even for ourselves, what's the question that our life is trying to answer? As Terry often says, what is the legacy that I'm leaving? What have I learned from those behaviors in my family of origin that I've adopted, but that I need to jettison, you know? And what are the ones that I want to pass on to further generations? This whole idea that we are not an isolated self, but that we are a web of relationships, that our identity is based in a web of relationships. And that's what has formed and shaped us. That's what Confucianism really emphasizes. We'll try to sort out the links for next week, gang. Next week we'll talk about Taoism and how Chinese religion is really a rich mix of Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and tribal indigenous rituals and faith.